With this next packet, we're going to be dealing with distance, midpoint, Pythagorean theorem, and then we're going to be dealing with unit conversions in the very last part of the packet. But let's start with the distance formula. It's this big funky looking thing right here. D equals the square root of x sub 2 minus x sub 1 squared plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1 squared. Now that looks very complicated, but there's a couple of things here. First, pretty much all you're doing is substituting numbers in, so it's really not a hard formula. And then second, you don't have to memorize this, even if you're on the test, because even when you get to the EOC, you're going to have this formula along with the midpoint formula. You'll have all of those on a reference sheet. So you don't have to memorize this, is what I'm saying. So you can stop worrying about that already. So let's go ahead and get into it here. We'll do a basic problem starting out. Right now I really don't know what to do with all this, but if we look over here, let's use these coordinate points. Now if you remember coordinate points from way back when we were talking with slope and slope formula and all that, we're dealing with coordinate points. These two numbers represent an x value and a y value, and every set of parentheses always has an x and a y. What we first want to do when we are given two sets of points, whether we're using distance or midpoint or slope or whatever, we want to go ahead and label what our points are. So this first point is going to be x1 and y1, and this one's going to be x2 and y2. Now I've had a lot of questions in class about what the 1 and the 2 mean. It's real simple. This is your first group of numbers, so we call them group 1. This is your second group of numbers. We call them group 2, so that's why we have the 2's right there. We know they each have a x and a y in them, so that's why this is x1 and y1. So this is the x and the y in group 1. This is the x and the y in group 2. And that's how you can differentiate the two numbers, or the two sets of numbers. So from here, it's really simple. All we have to do is plug in numbers if we need to. So let's do that real quick. So square root, we want all of these things to be underneath that entire big long square root symbol, okay? So my first number that I need is my x sub 2. So I'm going to open up my parentheses, and x sub 2 is 5. So I'm going to enter that in real quick right here. So my first value was x2, and I sub that in right here in the first position. Now we do a minus sign. Now we do x sub 1. X sub 1 is 4. So put that right there, close off my parenthesis, and I square it. Plus, bring the plus sign down, then I open up another set of parentheses. Now I've got to put y2 values in, which is negative 1, and then minus y sub 1, which is 3. And then I close off my parentheses and I square it. Now if you've got a TI-83 calculator or better, you can put this whole thing in just like it is right here and go ahead and get your answer, but let's go ahead and work this out step by step. Basically what I'm doing from here, now that I've got all my numbers entered, is I'm going to just simplify this as far as I can go. So let's work out my parentheses first. 5 minus 4 gives me 1 squared. And it's very important that you keep these parentheses here, because if you come out with a negative number, as you're about to see, you have to have those parentheses in order for this to work correctly. So negative 1 minus 3 is going to give me negative 4. And as long as I keep that in parentheses, that will work. Okay? Now, square root, bring that sign down real quick here. 1 squared gives me 1 plus negative 4 squared, which is 16, positive 16. 1 plus 16 gives me the square root of 17. Now you can take a decimal of that if you want to. You don't have to. This is actually the simplified square root of that. But if you did take the decimal of that, it would be 4.12. So that is one way you might find the answer. So both this and this are the simplified versions of this answer, whichever one it is looking for on your test. Now, let me go through a few common mistakes people have here. The number one main problem is that when you're entering in numbers up here in the very beginning of this problem, you're not carrying that negative sign down into the problem. So if it's a -1 up here, you have to put a -1 down here. So that's the main part that gets kind of confusing. One of the other problems you'll have is right here in this step, the third step down, if you don't use your parentheses, you have a -4 and you square that. If you use a calculator, it's going to give you a -16 instead of a +16. So the problem with that is that it's going to give you a negative square root, and you cannot take a negative. So let's say you had a -16. You can't take a square root of a negative, at least not until Algebra 2 when they go over imaginary numbers. So you can't do that. That's why those parentheses are extremely important, that you keep those there. Okay, so make sure you got those parentheses all the way through, and then from there, if you can just do that, those few things, these will be very, very easy problems.